Dr. Dixon, a lot of people don't know Georgia was actually a buffer state, right? Why was
Buffer
Georgia
zone, yes.
buffer zone? Why was that?
Because what happens is initially the Pope gives Spain authority over all North America, from Newfoundland all the
Yep.
way down to the Key Biscayne, right?
Mm.
And of course, the French and the English don't pay the Pope any attention. They say the Pope got no authority to tell y'all can have all of this land.
Right.
And so the French come first. And just like with the Spanish, just like with the English and the French, all of their first colonies failed.
Mm.
It was Gueldape with the Spanish that failed. Fort Caroline, it was a small area, and then they tried to redevelop the area and they called it Fort Caroline.
Mm.
It failed.
Mm.
And then, of course, for the English, it was Roanoke, right?
Yep.
Roanoke failed.
Yep.
And so once they, however, started becoming successful, right, in colonization, the English started expanding plantation society very fast, rapidly.
Mm.
And so the Spanish and the English were already at war in Europe.
Mm.
And the war then spilled over into this hemisphere.
Right.
And it spilled over into of course, the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
and then it spilled over, of course, into North America.
Yeah.
And so a treaty was struck that the Carolinas would have a line of demarcation.
Mm.
La Florida would have a line of demarcation.
Mm.
And the area between those two lines was called the buffer zone.
Mm.
But the English, being who they are, they ignored the treaty.
For sure. Yep.
And they moved in and they settled Savannah.
Mm.
And when they settled Savannah, they broke the treaty.
Wow.
And the war continued on in Europe, and they had skirmishes in this hemisphere.
Hmm.
Because you see it happening in 1763. The English go down into the Caribbean and they capture Havana.
Wow.
And they give the Spanish a choice. We'll give you Havana back if you give us La Florida.
Mm.
Or we can just keep Havana.
Mm.
And of course, that was an easy choice, right? All the money is still being made in the Caribbean at this time.
Yeah, yeah,
especially,
yeah.
Especially with the Spanish, because see, the Spanish aren't concerned with the East Coast.
Mm.
The Spanish are concerned about the gold and the silver that they find across the Gulf there.
That's right.
In present day Southwest, California, Mexico, yep. Central America, yep. And of course, South America.
That's right.
So they were far more concerned about the gold than yep. the East Coast of present day United States.
Mm.
So they said you can have it. So the British take over in 1763, and they keep it until 1781.
Wow.
They keep it about 20 years. And what happens is that the Spanish take advantage of the American Revolution, right? That comes in 1776.
Mm-hmm.
They go into the Caribbean and they capture Barbados.
Wow.
And they give them the same choice.
Mm.
We'll give you Barbados back if you give us La Florida.
Wow.
Or we can just keep Barbados. But at this time, that was the English prime sugar island.
Wow.
So that was out. So it was an easy choice for them. They gave La Florida back.
Wow.
You see, so in all of those things, right? That's basically how we see um, both United States as well as a lot of your states and Caribbean nations developing
Mm-hmm.
through either war or through agricultural expansion.
Yes, sir. Wow.
So Georgia is done through agricultural expansion.
Yep.
Florida is done through war. Uh, Alabama and Mississippi are done through agricultural expansion with cotton.
Yep.
Louisiana, of course, was simply bought. You know.
Louisiana Purchase.
So,
Louisiana Purchase. I was just saying.
right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Louisiana
Yep.
Purchase.
Yep. Yep.
Which was bought for the ideas of agriculture.
Wow.
Use agricultural expansion.
Wow.
And they could not have done it if it wasn't for the rest of the South.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have had the money to buy the Louisiana Purchase.
For sure. Wow. That's so interesting. Dr. Dixon, during this time, of course, we're talking about pre-technological advances when it comes to cell phones, GPS, all of those things of sorts. Right. How did our enslaved ancestors know where to even run to, how to get to Florida, how to get to the Great Dismal Swamps? How did they know to trace those steps, and then who to even talk to during those times?
Well, two things. It's two things there, right? Mm-hmm. It's two basic. I don't know what a balloon.
Oh, right. I saw the balloon.
It's two basic concepts, right? The first is, I don't know what that is, brother. Am I doing that? I don't know. Maybe that's somebody. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, probably like one of the little kid hackers, so they hack Zoom calls.
The basic concept, first of all, is any movement and expansion, right? And when I say expansion, I mean migration, whether it's forced migration or however the case may be. Migratory patterns during these periods of time are going to be based on finding and locating a water source. Right? So they have to find a water source.
Wow.
The swamp provided the best area because it provided the water source that they needed, but it also provided one other thing, and that was the protection from whites.
Wow.
And that protection came primarily not through the alligators, as most people think, but primarily through the mosquitoes.
Okay. Very interesting.
See, because mosquitoes at that time brought yellow fever.
Okay.
And whites and Europeans were highly susceptible to yellow fever.
Wow.
So, and this was known early in earlier periods. Within the transatlantic slave trade, as well as earlier periods, particularly in low country.
Yeah.
This is why you had what you call absentee ownership. You had all of these sugar plantations down on the coast of Carolina, down on the coast of Georgia, right? On the southern end of North Carolina, on the northern end of Florida, present-day Florida, right? All of these either rice or indigo plantations have a large number of mosquitoes.
Wow.
Right? Wow. Because mosquitoes need water to breathe.
Yep, that's right.
And so the water, though, and the mosquitoes was a signal for whites as danger, though. Because yellow fever could wipe out a whole family.
Wow.
One person in the house could get yellow fever. They have to be quarantined and everything else.
Wow.
And so they would have what would at that time, of course, the master's house or the quote unquote big house would be closer to up country, miles away. And so we had what we call absentee ownership.
Wow.
So they knew that. They knew that going into the swamps was an area that only the catchers would come into. They are not going to come into this area to try to build a colony.
Wow.
They're not going to come into this area to really try to expand.
Wow.
And so, again, the swamp provided those two things, right? They provided the water source and they provided the protection through the mosquitoes and yellow fever.
Wow. Wow. That's very interesting. Andrew Jackson made his political bones, if you will, in Florida, right?
Yes.
What did Andrew Jackson encounter and experience even while interacting and trying to war with the Seminoles during his time?
Well, what he did was he used the age-old tactic, right? And that age-old tactic has been used by the English rather, pretty much since they came out of the Dark Ages. And that tactic was divide and conquer.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. That's right.
And so Andrew Jackson was able to recognize and understand the difference between the Seminoles and the Creeks and the factions of Creeks that had separated.
Right.
And so he was able to use that divide and conquer technique between the Creeks and the Seminoles.
Wow.
And so, and first he used it initially within the Creek Nation to figure out who was who, and then used it between the Creek and Seminole Nation. Right? And so with this divide and conquer technique, he was able to move all the way throughout the Panhandle and throughout the Gulf, and of course in New Orleans and the Battle of New Orleans and all of that good stuff with England in the War of 1812 by utilizing the different factions of Native Americans who didn't get along.
Wow.
Right? And so he is notified at the end of the War of 1812 by Plantation Society about the Negro Fort. He had heard about it, but now he was told, he was given full information. And so what the Negro Fort represented was the fact that these runaway, formerly enslaved people who had run away were given a fort by the British, and that meant that they were on their way to developing their own colony. And so that, they said, could not stand.
Right.
That plantation society would never reach its fullest potential if they knew that, if their enslaved knew that they could run away and reach the Negro Fort, and there was a colony of free blacks who had at some point absconded themselves. So Andrew Jackson obliges, he comes back through the Panhandle and he burns the Negro Fort down.
Wow.
And then of course, the First Seminole War begins. After the First Seminole War, we see the direct linkage between the First Seminole War and Florida becoming a territory. And so when Florida becomes a territory, what happens is the war ends in late 1818. Florida, by that spring, the United States and Spain went into a treaty in which Spain ceded Florida over to the United States.
Wow.
However, it gave them a 2-year transformation period. So basically, they just gave Spain 2 more years to collect taxes
Wow.
and get you whomever, whatever, things you want to leave. Let all of your citizens know of the change, because no telephones, right?
Right, exactly.
No internet. And then you got to be gone by 1821 with the official transfer of flags. But the treaty was signed in 1819.
Wow.
And so in 1821, when the United States takes over, Andrew Jackson is appointed territorial governor.
Wow.
So basically, though at this point, when you look at it in the early days, right, in the early periods, Florida was still more under military rule. And then, of course, they put themselves together, formed a territorial government, and had elections.
Wow.
But before that, Andrew Jackson was the governor, and he was only the governor for 9 months.
Wow.
And he got the political bug, went to DC, and the rest is history, right?
Man,
and so we also understand, though, that during this time in Florida, right? Because you have to understand at that time, La Florida stretched all the way to the Mississippi River.
Okay.
Alabama doesn't become a state until 1817. Mississippi doesn't become a state until 1819.
Wow.
So, and we're talking about the War of 1812. So that was all Florida, all the way to the Mississippi.
Wow.
And so I said all of that to say, right, the ideals of the Indian removal policy were initially developed by Jackson during his time and from his time he spent in La Florida.